The sky over Germany in the spring of 1945 was a graveyard. It was a vast, cold, empty space, punctuated by the contrails of high-flying American bombers and the fleeting, violent streaks of cannon fire. For Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann of the Luftwaffe, it was no longer the glorious arena of the hunter. It was a slaughterhouse, and he was a prey. He slammed the stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 to the left, the airframe groaning in protest, the G-forces trying to pull the blood from his brain. A stream of .50 caliber tracers, like fiery red claws, sliced through the space where his cockpit had been a fraction of a second ago. Below him, a swarm of American P-51 Mustangs was systematically dismantling his squadron. Klaus, at 22 years old, was a veteran, but a veteran in 1945 meant something very different than it had in 1941. He was a survivor of a war of attrition that Germany was catastrophically losing. He had seen the best pilots of the Luftwaffe fall, one by one, replaced by teenagers with only a few dozen hours of flight time. He flew a machine that was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was running on ersatz fuel that fouled the engine, and it was maintained by weary, overworked ground crews who were running out of spare parts. His opponents, by contrast, were a tidal wave. They were young, confident Americans, flying the P-51 Mustang, a fighter so perfect, so dominant, that German pilots had given it a bitter nickname, the Cadillac of the Sky. They came in endless numbers, their silver fuselages glinting in the sun, symbols of an industrial might that Germany could no longer hope to match. Today's mission had been an act of pure desperation. A massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses was heading for a synthetic oil plant near Hamburg. Klaus's Jagdgeschwader, or fighter wing, had scrambled to intercept. They were outnumbered at least 5-1. The ensuing battle was not a duel. It was a chaotic, swirling melee. Klaus was a professional. He ignored the escorting fighters, diving through them towards his real target, the bombers, the fat cats, as the Germans called them. He latched onto a straggler, a B-17 that had fallen slightly out of protective combat box. He lined it up, his thumb resting on the trigger. He had to get close, inside the overlapping fields of fire from the bomber's dozen machine guns. It was a suicide run. He pushed the throttle forward, his Daimler-Benz engine screaming. Tracers from the bomber's tail. Gunner reached out for him. He could see the flashes from the waist guns. He held his nerve, his entire world narrowing to the bomber in his gun sight. At 200 meters, he fired, a short, precise burst from his 20mm cannons. He saw the shell strike the B-17's wing near the inboard engine. A small flicker of orange appeared, then blossomed into a raging fire. The bomber's wing sagged. It began to fall away from the formation, trailing a thick plume of black smoke. A kill, but there was no triumph, no elation, just a cold, grim satisfaction of a job done, and then his world exploded. A P-51, appearing as if from nowhere, had latched onto his tail. The first burst of its 6.50 caliber guns hammered into his 109. The canopy perspex crazed. A row of holes stitched themselves across his left wing. The plane shuddered violently. An alarm light flashed on his instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Klaus threw his fighter into a violent series of maneuvers, a splitus, a spiraling dive. Anything to shake the relentless American. He dove for the clouds, the one place he might find refuge. For 10 frantic minutes, he played a desperate game of cat and mouse in the cloud tops, twisting, turning, using every trick he knew. Finally, he broke out into clear air. He was alone. The P-51 was gone. A wave of relief washed over him, so profound it left him weak. He was alive. He took a deep, ragged breath and assessed the situation. His plane was damaged but flyable. His left wing was sluggish, and the hydraulic leak meant he would have no flaps and possibly no landing gear. But the engine was still running. The real problem was his location. In the chaos of the dogfight, he had been pushed far to the west. He was deep inside Allied-controlled airspace. Every minute he flew, he was a trespasser in a hostile sky. And then he saw it. The fuel gauge, the needle, which had been comfortably in the green when he took off, was now hovering on the last red mark. Empty. The dogfight, the desperate dive, the full throttle escape. It had all consumed his fuel at a ravenous rate. He had, at most, 5 minutes of flight time left. 5 minutes to cross 100 miles of enemy territory. It was impossible. He was a dead man. The rhythmic heartbeat of the Daimler-Benz in front of him, the sound that had been the soundtrack to his life for the past 3 years, was about to fall silent, and he would become just another casualty, a falling stone in a foreign sky. The silence, when it came, was not sudden. It was a gradual, sickening decay. The powerful roar of the Daimler-Benz engine faltered, coughed once, twice, and then died. The propeller, which had been a transparent, shimmering disc, slowed into a collection of individual, lazily windmilling blades. In an instant, Klaus Hoffmann's Messerschmitt Bf 109 was no longer a fighter plane. It was a 6,000-pound glider, a brick with wings, its forward momentum the only thing keeping it from falling out of the sky. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped him. His training provided 2 options. The first was to bail out, pop the canopy, unbuckle his harness, and throw himself into the void, hoping his parachute would open, hoping he wouldn't be shot by ground troops, hoping to survive the brutal interrogations that would surely follow his capture. It was a sensible choice. The second option was a forced landing. Try to find a field, a road, any stretch of flat ground, and attempt to belly land a crippled aircraft. It was a far riskier choice. A bad landing could mean a fiery death, but it also offered a sliver of a chance, however remote, of evading capture, of finding a way back to German lines. His mind, trained for rapid decisions under extreme pressure, weighed the options in a fraction of a second. He was a pilot. His instinct was to fly the plane until the very last moment. He would not abandon his aircraft. He would attempt a landing. He began to glide, trading altitude for airspeed, his eyes desperately scanning the landscape below. It was a patchwork of green fields and dark forests, dotted with small villages. It looked peaceful, but Klaus knew it was crawling with the enemy. He needed a long, open field away from any towns. He spotted a potential candidate, a large pasture several miles ahead. He banked the silent aircraft towards it, his heart pounding. Every foot of lost altitude was a resource he could never get back. He was completely, utterly helpless. He was a hawk with broken wings, circling, waiting for the inevitable return to Earth. It was in this moment of supreme vulnerability that he saw the glint of sunlight on polished aluminum. His blood ran cold. It was AP-51 Mustang. It was approaching fast from his left, its sleek, shark-like profile unmistakable. The American pilot must have seen his windmilling propeller, a clear sign of a powerless aircraft. This was it, the final indignity. He had survived the dogfight, escaped the chase, only to be found, helpless and defenseless, and shot out of the sky like a clay pigeon. It was not a matter of honor. It was a matter of sport for the American now. He would be an easy, zero-risk kill, a final notch on some young pilot's scoreboard. Klaus braced himself for the impact of the .50 caliber rounds. He closed his eyes, a flicker of prayer on his lips. He waited. 1 second. 2. 5. Nothing. He opened his eyes. The P-51 was not on his tail. It was pulling up alongside him, matching his speed. Its own powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine throttled back to a gentle hum. It was so close he could see the pilot in the cockpit, a young man in a leather helmet and oxygen mask, not much older than himself. The American just sat there, flying in perfect formation with him, less than 50 feet away. Klaus stared, bewildered. What was this? Was he toying with him? Was this some kind of psychological game before the kill? He could see the details on the American plane. The name, Ohio, painted on the nose. The victory markings, small swastikas, neatly stenciled below the cockpit. This was an ace, an experienced killer. And yet, he wasn't firing. The American pilot, Lieutenant Chuck Yeager of the 357 Fighter Group, was just as confused. He had become separated from his squadron during the massive dogfight and was heading home when he saw the lone Bf 109. His first instinct was pure predator. An enemy fighter, alone and damaged. He had closed in for the kill, his thumb resting on the trigger. But as he got closer, he saw the dead propeller. The German was a glider. Jaeger, a man who would one day become the most famous test pilot in history, was a country boy from West Virginia. He had a simple, clear-cut code. You fought hard, you fought to win, but you didn't shoot a man in a parachute. This, to him, was the same thing. The German was defenseless. The fight was over. Shooting him down now would be an execution, not combat. It would be murder. So he eased off the trigger and pulled up alongside, driven by a raw, powerful curiosity. He wanted to see his enemy. He wanted to look him in the eye. In the cockpit of the 109, Klaus was a bundle of raw nerves. The American just kept flying there, his silver Mustang a silent, menacing presence. Klaus could see the 6 machine guns lining the leading edge of the P-51's wing. They were right there, black, ominous circles pointed directly at him. A single squeeze of a trigger was all that separated him from oblivion. The American pilot raised a gloved hand. He pointed down, toward the ground, then made a gesture as if to say, "Are you going down?" Klaus, understanding, nodded grimly. He pointed to his dead engine, then made a downward motion with his hand. The American nodded back, a gesture of understanding. Then the American did something that defied all logic. He smiled. Klaus could see it even through the oxygen mask. The man's eyes crinkled. He gave Klaus a jaunty little wave, almost a salute. It was a gesture of what? Respect? Pity? Comradeship? It was the most surreal moment of Klaus's life. He was flying a crippled plane out of fuel, deep in enemy territory, about to attempt a life-or-death forced landing, and his mortal enemy was flying beside him, giving him a friendly wave. The P-51 stayed with him. It continued to fly in perfect formation, a silent, silver guardian angel. As Klaus neared the field he had chosen, the American pilot gently banked his Mustang away, giving him space. But he didn't leave. He climbed to 1,000 feet and began to circle, watching. Klaus understood. The American was staying to see what would happen. He was a witness. He was there to see if the German pilot would make it. The act transformed the American from a threat into something else, something Klaus had no name for. He was no longer just an enemy. He was a fellow pilot. With the P-51 circling above like a patient vulture, Klaus Hoffman focused on the task at hand, landing a high-performance fighter with no engine and no hydraulics. The pasture he had chosen looked good from a distance, but as he got closer, he could see it was far from perfect. It was uneven, with patches of long grass, and what looked like a small ditch running through the middle. There was no room for error. He had only one shot at this. The lack of hydraulics was a critical problem. Without hydraulic pressure, his landing gear would not deploy. He had to use the emergency manual release system. He reached for a lever and pulled hard. Nothing happened. He pulled again, putting all his strength into it, his muscles screaming in protest. With a reluctant, grinding sound, the right landing gear unlocked and dropped into place. But the left one remained stubbornly stuck in the wing. He had only one wheel down. A one-wheeled landing of a fighter with a narrow, unstable undercarriage was a recipe for disaster. The plane would almost certainly ground loop, a violent, cartwheeling skid that would tear the aircraft apart and likely kill him. He had seconds to decide. He could try to get the other wheel down, wasting precious altitude and speed, or he could retract the one good wheel and attempt a belly landing. A belly landing would destroy the plane, but it was more survivable. It was the only real choice. He hit the gear release, and the single extended wheel retracted back into the wing. It would be a belly landing. He was now fully committed. The ground was rushing up fast. He flared the aircraft, pulling the nose up to bleed off as much speed as possible, trying to stall it just a few feet above the grass. The 109 floated, hanging in the air for a breathless moment. Then it touched down. The impact was not a smooth slide. It was a violent, jarring crash. The propeller blades, which were still windmilling slowly, dug into the soft earth and snapped off with a sound like breaking bones. The airframe shrieked as it tore through the pasture, a long, deep scar of ripped-up turf trailing behind it. The plane slid for 100 yards, spinning sideways, before finally shuddering to a halt not far from the ditch he had spotted. Silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the gentle ticking of cooling metal. Klaus sat in the cockpit, his body trembling with adrenaline. He was alive. He was on the ground. He had survived. He took a moment to collect himself, then popped the canopy. The fresh, cool air of the German countryside filled his lungs. He scrambled out of the cockpit and onto the wing, his legs shaky. His beautiful Messerschmitt was a wreck. Its belly was torn open, the propeller gone, the wings bent, but it had not caught fire. It had protected him. He looked up. The P-51 Mustang was still there, making one final, low pass over the crash site. Klaus could see the pilot clearly now in the bubble canopy. The American waggled his wings, a final, definitive salute. Then he pulled up, banked his fighter to west, and disappeared into the horizon, heading for home. Klaus stood on the wing of his broken fighter and watched him go, a profound sense of awe and gratitude washing over him. The American pilot, his enemy, had shown him a mercy he had no right to expect. He had honored an unwritten code, a chivalry of the air that transcended the hatred of their nations. This moment of grace, in the midst of a war defined by its brutality, was something Klaus knew he would never forget. His reverie was broken by the sound of shouting. A farmer, carrying a pitchfork like a rifle, was running towards him across the field. Behind him were several other villagers, their faces a mixture of fear and anger. Klaus's ordeal was not over. He was still a downed pilot in hostile territory. He raised his hands in a clear sign of surrender. The story of what happened next depends on which version you believe. This incident, the encounter between Chuck Yeager and the German pilot, has become a piece of aviation folklore, told and retold over the years. In some versions, Klaus is captured by the farmers and turned over to the authorities, his war ending in a POW camp. But in other versions, the story takes a different, more poignant turn. According to this telling, Klaus, using his limited knowledge of the local dialect, managed to convince the farmers that he was not a threat. He was just a young man, a pilot who had crashed. He pointed to his wrecked plane, his empty hands. The farmers, seeing not a fearsome Nazi warrior but scared, exhausted young man, lowered their makeshift weapons. They saw the wreckage, the incredible violence of the crash, and they saw the man who had walked away from it. Their anger was replaced by a kind of grudging, rural respect for his survival. They did not turn him in. Instead, they hid him. They gave him civilian clothes, fed him, and sheltered him in a barn for several days. They saw him not as an enemy soldier, but as a human being in need of help. After a few days, under the cover of darkness, they guided him towards the German lines, pointing him in the right direction, giving him a piece of bread and a canteen of water for his journey. Klaus Hoffmann, according to this version of the tale, walked for 2 weeks, traveling by night, sleeping in forests, until he finally crossed back into German-held territory and was reunited with his unit. He had been saved twice in one day, once by the chivalry of his enemy, and once by the humanity of the civilians he was supposed to be at war with. Chuck Yeager, for his part, landed back at his base in England. He never officially reported the encounter. In his logbook, he simply noted a long flight and no enemy contact. Sparing a defenseless enemy was not something the top brass would have understood or approved of. It was a secret he kept for many years. It was just a quiet, personal moment between two pilots, a shared understanding in the sky that had no place in the official records of the war. For decades, the two men lived their separate lives. The German pilot's identity was lost to history, becoming simply the German Yeager spared. Yeager himself went on to become a global icon, the first man to break the sound barrier, a test pilot who pushed the boundaries of flight, and became the living embodiment of the right stuff. His act of mercy in 1945 was a small, forgotten footnote in a legendary career. But stories like this have a way of enduring. They persist because they speak to a deeper truth about the nature of war. They remind us that even in the most savage of conflicts, moments of grace, honor, and shared humanity can and do occur. They are the exceptions that prove the rule, the flickers of light in the overwhelming darkness. The encounter between the German pilot in his dead Bf-109 and the American ace in his P-51 was one such flicker. It was an unwritten, unspoken agreement between two men who recognized each other, not as German or American, not as Nazi or ally, but simply as fellow pilots, bound by a code that the war on the ground could never fully erase. The story could have ended there, a piece of aviation apocrypha, a testament to the unwritten rules of aerial combat, with the German pilot's identity forever remaining a mystery. For nearly 50 years, it was exactly that. Chuck Yeager mentioned the incident in passing in his autobiography, but with few details, treating it as just one of many strange occurrences in a long and eventful life. But in the 1990s, a retired German fighter pilot named George Peter Eder, himself a respected ace, began a quest. He was a historian of the Luftwaffe, dedicated to preserving the stories of his comrades. He had heard the tale of the spared pilot and became convinced that it was not a myth, but a real event that deserved to be fully documented. He believed that the anonymous German pilot should be identified, and that the two men, if they were both still alive, should be brought together. Eder began a painstaking search, cross-referencing Luftwaffe and Allied combat reports from the spring of 1945. The task was immense. Records were incomplete, destroyed, or scattered. He interviewed dozens of surviving German pilots, asking if they had ever been in a situation like the one described. For years, his search turned up nothing. Most of the pilots who flew in those desperate final months of the war did not survive. The story seemed destined to remain a legend, but Eder persisted. Finally, he came across the name of a pilot from Jägerschwader 300, Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann. The official records were brief. They noted that on a mission in March 1945, Hoffmann's Bf-109 was severely damaged in combat with P-51s. His plane was last seen losing fuel and altitude deep inside Allied territory. He was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. On a hunch, Eder dug deeper. He managed to track down Hoffmann's family, and he discovered something incredible. Klaus Hoffmann was not dead. He had survived the war. After his incredible ordeal, the crash landing and his subsequent trek back to German lines, he had been reunited with his squadron, but with the war ending just weeks later, he was captured by Allied ground forces and spent a brief time in a POW camp before being released. He had returned to his hometown, became an engineer, married, had a family, and lived a quiet, unassuming life, never speaking of his wartime experiences. Eder contacted Klaus Hoffmann, now an old man in his 70s. He asked him about the last mission, about the crash. Klaus, hesitant at first, slowly began to recount the story he had locked away for half a century. He described the dogfight, the engine failure, the terrifying glide, and then he described the P-51, the silver angel that had pulled up beside him, the pilot who had looked in the eye and given him a salute. Every detail matched the story Yeager had told.